August 3rd, 1945, Seagoville Internment Camp, Texas. The heat pressed down like a heavy hand, smelling of dust, sweat, and strong army coffee. 23-year-old German nurse Lieselotte Weber stepped off the truck, sure she was walking into hell. Chains, straw on the floor, shouts in a language she barely knew. When an American sergeant asked, "Any medical problems?" she whispered, "I haven't slept in a bed in 2 years," and braced herself for laughter or cruelty. Instead, he opened a door, and cool air with the clean smell of soap and fresh sheets flowed out over rows of neatly made steel beds. Lieselotte saw the white pillow waiting for her, and suddenly began to cry, because nothing in her Nazi training had prepared her for kindness from an enemy. What happened to her in that room would change how she saw America, Germany, and the whole war. Stay with me to hear how one bed in Texas rewrote a German prisoner's life. And if you want more true World War II stories like this, please subscribe, hit like, and watch to the end. March 3rd, 1943, Cologne, Germany. The sirens began just after midnight, a rising metal scream that pushed through brick walls and thin blankets. 21-year-old nurse trainee Lieselotte Weber sat up on her narrow bed, feet touching the cold wooden floor, and already knew this alarm was different. The air smelled thick, like coal smoke and fear, as her father shouted from the hallway, "Keller, schnell, to the cellar, now!" They ran down the stairs with the rest of the tenants, past framed pictures that rattled against the wall. In the basement, 60 people packed into a space built for 20. The air was wet and close, someone's cheap cologne mixed with sweat and the chalky smell of brick dust. Above them, the first bombs fell with a flat, distant thump, then a closer one. Light bulbs swung. Dust sifted down. A baby cried so hard it had no sound left. Later, she would write in a letter, "You could feel the building shiver like a living thing." Cologne had already known war from the sky. By 1943, Allied forces had bombed the city more than 120 times. That year alone, British and American planes dropped thousands of tons of explosives on its streets and churches. By the end of the war, nearly 95% of the old city centre would lie in ruins. But on this night, Lieselotte could not think in numbers. She thought only of her small room on the 3rd floor, her white-painted bed with its wool blanket folded just so by habit. The final wave hit close. There was a tearing roar, a rush of hot air through the cellar, then darkness as the power failed. People screamed. Someone's hand clamped down on her wrist so hard it hurt. Dust filled her mouth. For a moment she could taste brick and plaster and something else, like burned cloth. When the all clear finally sounded and the doors were forced open, the stairway was half blocked by rubble. Outside, the street looked wrong, like a picture that had been torn and badly put back together. Her building was a broken shell. The 3rd floor was gone. Where her room had been, there was only open air and smoke. She stood in the street in borrowed wooden clogs, looking up at the empty space. In a later interview, she said quietly, "I remember thinking very clearly, my bed is gone. I will never sleep there again." It was a small loss in a city of thousands of dead, but it marked her. From that night on, she never slept in a real bed in Germany again. Her family was split by the bombing. Her father was sent to repair railway lines. Her mother was evacuated to the countryside with younger relatives. Lieselotte stayed. The regime needed nurses. Posters said, "The German woman cares for the wounded front fighter." She believed them. At 19, she had joined the nursing school with pride, wearing the white apron and the small swastika badge on her collar. There was a paradox at the center of her days. She was trained to save lives inside a system that was destroying whole cities. She watched wounded soldiers brought in from the front, legs missing, lungs burned by smoke, and thought, "If I work harder, we will win, and this will stop." She did not yet see that more work only fed the machine. By late 1944, the field hospital where she served had moved twice, each time farther east, following the shrinking front. It ended up in a village near the Rhine, inside a school building that smelled of chalk, cabbage soup, and carbolic disinfectant. The beds here were not really beds either. They were iron frames without real mattresses, covered with thin straw sacks that went damp in the cold. When space ran out, stretchers lined the hallway, cold canvas over metal. She slept where she could, on a folded blanket on the floor between wards. On a stair landing, sometimes sitting up in a chair with a coat over her knees. "You learn to sleep like a thief," she later wrote. "You steal 10 minutes here, 20 there. Always in your clothes, always ready to run." By early 1945, the war had turned into a flood running backwards across Germany. In the West, more than 3.6 million homes had been destroyed by bombing. Refugees clogged the roads. The Rhine, once a proud frontier, became a last barrier. In March, American guns began to speak from the far bank. Their shells had a different sound from German ones, a heavier crack, a pause, then the thud of impact that shook dust from the schoolhouse beams. The wards smelled of ether, sweat, and fear. At night, through broken windows, she could see the western sky flash with artillery. The order to retreat never came. Instead, one morning there were shouts in the street, the harsh clatter of tank tracks on cobblestones, and the strange sound of English shouted through amplifiers. "Come out with your hands up! Hospital staff, stay with your patients!" Lieselotte stood by a window and watched olive-drab uniforms move past the gate. For years, party meetings and radio voices had told her these men were monsters who would burn and torture German women. Her hands shook so hard she could not tie a bandage. Yet the first American she saw through the doorframe was a medic carrying a Red Cross bag, not a weapon. "I felt my world turn upside down," she recalled. The enemy we had been taught to hate looked at our wounded the same way I did. That day she put down her scissors, raised her hands, and became a prisoner of war, together with the doctors, orderlies, and the broken men in her care. Outside, trucks waited to take them to collection camps and later to the ports. She still had not slept in a real bed since that night in Cologne. The first one waiting for her would be on another continent, behind a fence in Texas. The trucks came at dawn, engines coughing in the cold. Lieselotte and the other nurses were loaded in with the wounded they could move, standing room only between stretchers. The canvas cover flapped, letting in strips of grey light and the smell of wet earth and exhaust. No one told them where they were going. Orders were simple. "You are prisoners now, you go where we take you." First came a holding area in a nearby town, a wired-off field that had once held cows. Now it held people. For 3 days they slept on the ground in their uniforms, wrapped in thin blankets. The nights were damp, the grass pressed cold and wet through the cloth. The Americans gave them metal cans of coffee in the morning and thick soup at night. It was more than many German civilians were getting, but fear still sat heavy in her stomach. "I waited for the cruelty they had promised us," she later said, "but it did not come." From there, trains took them west. The wagons were crowded, but they were not cattle cars. Each man and woman had a place to sit on wooden benches. Guards walked the corridor with rifles, but they did not shout or hit. When someone fainted, an American medic knelt down at once. Outside, through slats, Lieselotte saw the broken back of her country, bridges in the river, houses with no roofs, black craters where stations had been. At the French port, Le Havre, the air smelled of tar, salt, and rotting fish. Long lines of German prisoners moved toward the docks, thousands of them like columns of ants. By mid-1945, more than 370,000 German POWs would be shipped to camps in the United States, spread across about 500 main and branch camps. She was one small body in that mass. The ship waiting for them was a grey Liberty ship, built to carry 10,000 tons of cargo. Now its cargo was men and women. Inside, the holds were fitted with rough wooden bunks stacked 3 high. The air below decks was thick, diesel fumes, sweat, damp wood, and the sharp tang of disinfectant. When the hatches closed, the dark felt solid. The voyage took 12 days. Each morning they queued for food, white bread softer than anything she had seen in years, watery stew with real pieces of meat, black coffee that tasted of metal cups. An American officer read from a list. Rations were counted. About 3,000 calories a day, more than most civilians in Cologne ever saw after 1943. It was a strange thing to fill your stomach in chains. At night, the ship's engine beat like a slow heart through the metal walls. She lay on her plank bunk, straw tick under her back, and thought of torpedoes and sharks. Some prisoners whispered that they would be thrown into labor camps and worked to death. Others claimed they had heard on the front that Americans treated their prisoners well, even too well. No one knew what to believe. "I did not trust the food, I did not trust the smiles," she admitted in her memoir. "I waited for the trick. The first sight of America was a low line of green and roofs through hot mist. The ship entered the mouth of the Mississippi and slid up toward New Orleans. The air changed. It was warmer, heavy with river mud and spices, a smell she could not name. On the banks, she saw houses with whole walls, cars on roads without bomb craters, children riding bicycles. It felt like stepping into another world that had refused the war. Trains again, this time with open windows and padded seats. Guards handed out sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Fields rolled past, wide and flat, with fat cows and neat fences. In Germany, more than 3.6 million homes had been destroyed by bombing. Here, farmhouses stood clean and painted, clothes flapping on lines in the sun. Her destination was Segoville, an internment camp near Dallas, Texas. The compound covered more than 150 acres of scrubby land and low buildings, ringed with a double fence and guard towers. It had been built first as a prison, then used to hold enemy aliens, German, Italian, and Japanese civilians, many of them women. Now it would also hold captured German nurses like her. Processing began in a long, low hall that smelled of ink, sweat, and floor polish. Fluorescent lights hummed. An American sergeant with a clipboard sat behind a table. Beside him was an interpreter, a German-American in a neat khaki uniform. Name? Lieselotte Weber. Age? 23. Occupation? Krankenschwester. Nurse. The pencils scratched. Pages turned. Then came the question that had surprised her in the field hospital too. Any medical conditions we should know about? The sergeant asked. The interpreter repeated it in German. She started to say no. Then something in her loosened. Ich habe seit 2 Jahren nicht mehr in einem Bett geschlafen, she said. I have not slept in a bed for 2 years. The interpreter's eyebrows rose slightly as he translated. The sergeant stopped writing and looked at her for the first time, not at the paper. His eyes moved over her thin face, the lines of fatigue, the nurse's badge still pinned crookedly to her collar. 2 years? He repeated. She nodded, suddenly ashamed as if it were her fault. Cellars, floors, stretchers, she added, in broken English. The sergeant did not make a joke. He simply put down the pencil. After a moment, he said, "Well, ma'am, you'll sleep in a bed tonight." His voice was flat, but not unkind. An hour later, a woman guard in a crisp uniform led her and a small group of German nurses toward a low barracks building. The Texas heat hit like a wall, thick, buzzing with insects. Inside, though, the air was cooler. The smell changed to soap, bleach, and something else, starch. Rows of steel beds stood in 2 lines, each made up with a thin mattress, white cotton sheets, a grey army blanket folded at the foot, and 1 plump pillow. Sunlight fell in rectangles on the clean floor. Lieselotte stopped in the doorway. The sight of so many empty beds, made ready as if for guests, went through her like a knife. "I could not move," she said later. My legs stopped. Then I began to cry. The other women moved past her, touching the sheets with uncertain fingers, feeling the spring of the mattresses. Some laughed, high and nervous. One sat down and buried her face in the pillow, breathing in the dry, clean smell. The guard watched them with a tired, almost puzzled expression. This was not propaganda, this was reality. The so-called enemy had given her what her own country had not managed for 2 years. A real bed, a place to rest. What she found in that bed, in the days that followed, would change more than her body. It would change what she believed about friends and enemies, and about what kind of power wins a war. The first night in the Texas barracks, Lieselotte did not sleep much, even with the bed under her. The mattress felt too soft after wood and stone. The white sheet was almost painful to look at. Every time a truck passed on the road outside, the thin walls shook and she started awake, thinking of bombs. But by the second night, her body began to trust the springs. By the third, she slept 6 hours without moving. It was like learning to breathe again, she said later. I had forgotten what deep sleep felt like. Life in Segoville soon fell into a clear pattern. A bell rang at 6 in the morning. The air was cool then, with a faint smell of dew and dust. Women lined up to wash at long sinks, cold water splashing over tired faces. The camp rules were posted in German and English. No leaving the building without permission, no arguing with guards, no lights after 10. It was strict, but it was also clear, and after the chaos of the last year in Germany, clear rules felt almost like comfort. Breakfast was in a dining hall that had once been part of a prison. Now long tables held tin trays and chipped cups. On most days they received oatmeal or grits, 2 slices of white bread, a spoon of jam, and coffee. The coffee was bitter and thin, but it was hot and there was enough. A US inspection report from 1945 listed the daily ration for German prisoners at about 3,000 calories, meat, bread, vegetables, and sometimes fruit. It was close to what American soldiers ate. Many German civilians at home were living on half that. It confused me, Lieselotte wrote. They fed us like their own men. How could such an enemy be real? The camp held around 600 people, German women, some Italian women, a few children, and later a group of captured German nurses and female staff like her. They were fenced in with high wire and watched from wooden towers, yet inside the fence there were trees, grass, and even a small garden. On Sundays they could walk in a circle path for 1 hour under the hot sun. The Texas light was harsh and the air often smelled of dry earth and cut grass instead of smoke. There were searches. There were roll calls. Once a week, an American officer and an interpreter came to check the barracks. They opened lockers, looked under mattresses, counted blankets. But they did not shout. When they found a small drawing on the wall, charcoal sketches of Cologne rooftops, one guard looked at it for a long time and then said quietly, "Nice work," before ordering it wiped off. Work filled the days. As a trained nurse, Lieselotte was assigned to the camp infirmary. It smelled of rubbing alcohol, soap, and the faint, sick sweet scent of old bandages. Her patients were other prisoners, women with toothaches, fevers, depression. Sometimes American guards came too with sprains or headaches. She wrapped their wrists, took their temperatures and watched, surprised, as they said, "Thank you, ma'am," in careful German they had. Picked up. One guard, Private John Miller from Oklahoma, liked to practice his words on her. "Tafel, tafel, table," he would say, pointing. She would answer, "Table, yes," and point to the next thing. "Spoon." Soon they had a little English class going every afternoon in a quiet corner of the ward. It was a strange thing, she recalled. The same country that dropped bombs on us was now teaching me how to say good morning in their language. Classes became a regular part of camp life. A German-American woman from Dallas came twice a week to teach English grammar. She wrote on a blackboard that still smelled faintly of chalk dust and old lessons. I am, you are, we are. Many wrote letters home in careful lines, waiting for the Red Cross to send them across the ocean. By 1946, German prisoners in American camps would send millions of letters and cards back to Europe. Lieselotte's first one read, "I am alive. I sleep in a bed. Do not worry." Not everything was kind. Some guards were cold. One called them Hitler girls under his breath. News came in slow and hard pieces. The firebombing of Dresden, the discovery of camps in the east, the final collapse of Berlin. In the dining hall, someone smuggled in an old newspaper with photographs from Buchenwald. The room went quiet. We did not want to believe it, one of the other nurses said years later. But there it was. The pictures did not lie. The biggest contrast sat in her mind like a stone. The country that had built those camps had also trained her to heal. The country that had been called savage in every German speech was giving her clean sheets and a chance to study. This was not propaganda, it was reality, and it worked on her more slowly and deeply than any leaflet dropped from a plane. At night, lying in her Texas bed, she thought of her ruined street in Cologne, of cellar air that tasted of dust and fear. Then she thought of the day's English lesson, of Private Miller struggling to say Guten Morgen with a smile. Perhaps we did not know our enemies at all, she wrote in her diary. Perhaps we did not know ourselves. By the end of 1945, the war was over. The camp loudspeaker crackled with news of surrender, trials, and new borders. Rumors of repatriation grew stronger. One day, the interpreter announced that lists were being made. Some prisoners cheered, others fell silent. Lieselotte folded her blanket with care, suddenly unsure. She had come to this place as captive of a feared enemy and had found food, order, and a bed. Now she would be sent back to a homeland she barely recognized, with no clear idea what waited there. What she found when she stepped once more onto German soil would test everything she had learned behind the wire in Texas. October 1946, Bremerhaven, Germany. Cold wind came off the North Sea, sharp with salt and coal smoke. Lieselotte stood on the deck of the transport ship with a small bundle of clothes and one thin blanket. Behind her, America sank into the grey distance. Ahead, cranes and half-broken warehouses marked the port where she would walk back into freedom. It did not feel like freedom. The gangway creaked under boots. American guards checked names and waved the prisoners ashore. Their uniforms were cleaner now. Many had gained weight. They carried Red Cross parcels, camp papers, even photographs taken in Texas. But the dock they stepped onto was cracked and muddy. A burned-out locomotive lay on its side nearby, rusting where it had fallen. Inside a drafty hall that smelled of wet wool and old smoke, British officers and German clerks sorted them with quick questions. Name, place of birth. Where are you going now? Outside, loudspeakers called out towns and regions, directing people to trains that might or might not be running. By 1946, around 11 million Germans were on the move inside and around the borders of the defeated country. Refugees from the east, bombed-out families from cities, soldiers coming home from camps. Platforms were full of people with suitcases, sacks, and sometimes nothing but the clothes they wore. Lieselotte asked for cologne. The train that took her there had wooden benches, and no glass in some windows. Cold air blew through, carrying the smell of smoke and damp leaves. In the corner, a woman in a torn fur coat nursed a baby, whose eyes looked too big for its thin face. Nobody spoke much. The rhythm of the wheels, clack, 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 filled the silence. Cologne Station was a skeleton. The great roof had holes like missing teeth. Piles of bricks and twisted metal lay where shops had been. She stepped down into a world of grey dust and broken lines. It was as if someone had taken my city and crumpled it in their fist, she later said. She walked to the street where her family's apartment house had stood. She did not need a map. Her feet knew the way. But when she turned the last corner, there was no house, no doorway, no number on a wall. There was only a low mountain of rubble with weeds already growing in the cracks. Somewhere under tons of stone lay the spot where her white bed had once stood. In Texas, as a prisoner, she had slept on a clean mattress between sheets. Here, as a free German, she did not even have a floor that was hers. The paradox cut deep. I had been safer and more fed behind the American fence than I was now in my own country, she wrote. That was a bitter truth. Her parents were gone. A neighbor told her her father had died in 1944 in another air raid. Her mother, sent to relatives in the east, had never returned. There was no letter, no grave, only a shrug, and the words many heard in those days, verschollen, missing. So she went where many young women went, to the authorities. In the British occupation zone where Cologne now sat, office doors opened and closed all day on people asking for food cards, housing, work. The waiting room of the local Labour office smelled of damp coats and tired bodies. A sign on the wall listed priorities: former soldiers, widows with children, skilled workers. She held out her papers. Among them was a typed sheet from Segoville, stamped with an American eagle. It listed her as a trained nurse, with months of service in a US-run infirmary, and noted good conduct, and English language progress, satisfactory. The German clerk read it twice. Then he called over a British medical officer, a major in a faded uniform who smelled faintly of tobacco. The major asked, in English, "You worked in an American camp?" "Yes, sir," she answered, careful with the words. "In Texas. I am nurse." He nodded slowly. "We need nurses," he said. "Our hospitals are full. Many German doctors are dead or away." He did not say in prison, but she heard it anyway. In some German cities, up to half of all hospital buildings had been damaged or destroyed. Beds were scarce, medicine scarcer. Typhus and tuberculosis spread easily in crowded shelters. One report from 1946 counted more than 200,000 hospital beds lost across the western zones compared to before the war. The major offered her a post in a German ward inside a British-supported hospital on the edge of town. It was not much. A small cot in a shared room, 3 meals a day, and a tiny wage. But it was a place. It was work. On her first night there, she lay down on the narrow cot and looked up at the cracked ceiling. The mattress was thin, the blanket scratchy. The room smelled of disinfectant, boiled cabbage from the kitchen below, and the sour breath of exhausted women. Yet she thought of Texas. "This is not Segoville," she told herself, "but it is still a bed. I'm not back on the cellar floor." Her days filled quickly, washing wounds, changing sheets, comforting old women who cried for sons who would never come back. British medics walked the halls. Once in a while, an American officer came to inspect. When they did, she greeted them in their own language. "Good morning, sir." Their surprised smiles reminded her of Private Miller practicing Guten Morgen in the Texas infirmary. The skills she had learned in captivity, routine, cleanliness, English words, even the memory of fair treatment by enemies, became tools in this strange new life. They helped her hold steady in a land where almost everything else had broken. In her diary she wrote, "The bed in Texas did not follow me home, but what I learned lying awake in it did. I cannot hate the people who taught me to say thank you while I was their prisoner." In the years that followed, those lessons would shape more than her own survival. They would shape what kind of nurse, mother, and citizen she chose to become in the new West Germany. The years after 1946 passed first in a blur of work. In the half-repaired Cologne hospital, Lieselotte moved from cot to cot, washing faces, changing dressings, lifting bodies that were sometimes little more than bone and skin. Her hands smelled always of soap and carbolic. At night, she lay on her narrow bed in the nurses' dormitory and listened to the sounds of a broken city, distant hammers, coughing, an occasional train. Slowly, Germany changed around her. By 1950, the hospital received new beds, real ones with steel frames and clean mattresses. The British and Americans sent supplies under what people called the Marshall Plan. Between 1948 and 1952, West Germany received about $1.4 billion in aid, machines, medicine, food. In the wards, that number looked like fresh white sheets, new bottles of penicillin, and electric lights that stayed on. There was a strange feeling, she wrote. The flags that had once meant enemy were now printed on the boxes that kept our patients alive. One winter, a young man with a bad leg wound arrived from a factory accident. His name was Karl. He had been a soldier on the Eastern Front, then a prisoner of the Soviets. His nights were full of bad dreams. He woke shouting in Russian and German, sweating through the thin hospital blanket. The first time he saw an American officer in the corridor, he turned his face to the wall and muttered, "Schweinehunde, pigs." Lieselotte paused at his bed. "Not all of them," she said quietly in German. "Some gave me coffee and a bed." He looked at her as if she were mad. Later, when his pain was lower, she told him pieces of Texas. The taste of white bread after years of ration, the English classes, the way Private Miller had stumbled over German words and laughed at himself. Karl frowned. "It sounds like a fairy tale," he said. "They dropped bombs, they killed my brother." "Yes," she answered. "They did. And our side killed many of theirs. Both things are true. But in that camp, they treated me better than our own party treated its enemies. That, too, is true." He did not agree at once, but he listened. Months later, when he limped out of the hospital on a cane, he pressed her hand. "If I ever meet one of your Americans," he said, "I will remember your story before I speak." In 1952, she married him. They rented a small flat in a new concrete block on the edge of the city. The building smelled of fresh plaster and cheap paint, with coal smoke from the heating basement drifting up in winter. Their first child, a boy, slept in a second-hand crib under a roof that did not leak. By then, West Germany's economy was rising fast. Between 1950 and 1960, industrial production more than doubled. People called it the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. In the hospital, this miracle meant more wards, more staff, better pay. By the mid-1950s, the number of hospital beds in the Federal Republic had climbed back toward pre-war levels. New wings opened with tile floors and large windows. She became a senior nurse, training younger women who had not seen the war. When new nurses complained about long shifts, she would say, not unkindly, "I once changed bandages for 12 hours and then slept on a stone floor in my coat. This," she tapped the metal bed frame, "is better." She did not forget Texas. The language she had learned there stayed with her. In 1956, Cologne signed a partnership with a town in the United States. Delegations began to travel back and forth. Mayors, businessmen, later students. When a small group of American doctors and nurses visited the hospital, the director asked, "Who here speaks English?" Lieselotte stepped forward. Her heart pounded, but the words came easier than she expected. "Welcome to Cologne," she said. "I was once in your country as a prisoner." There was a small silence. Then one of the older American nurses, her hair already grey, reached out and squeezed Lieselotte's arm. "Then I'm glad to see you here, free," she replied. After that visit, more came. Youth groups, church people, former soldiers. Sometimes they sat in a circle in a community hall that smelled of coffee and wooden chairs, exchanging stories through translators. Sometimes they walked through the rebuilt streets, past shops where ruins had been. More than once, someone asked her to tell about her time in Segoville. She found that people leaned forward when she spoke of the bed. "I want you to understand," she would say. I did not become pro-American in that camp. I still missed my home. I still grieved. But when your country gives a clean bed to its enemy, it tells a truth about itself that no speech can erase. In the 1970s, her children were grown. Germany was divided. NATO bases dotted the western countryside, and American uniforms were now a common sight in train stations. Some of her neighbors, well, they often lived closer to the rules of the Geneva Convention than many civilians did in shattered German cities. Rations for POWs were officially tied to those of US soldiers. In some camps, they even received white bread and meat while their own families at home lined up for watery soup. Everywhere there were contrasts like this. A prisoner in Texas might wake to the smell of coffee from the camp kitchen, then read, weeks later, a Red Cross letter about children in his town digging through ash for coal scraps. A woman like Lizelot could lie on a clean mattress in Segoville, then return to Cologne and find not even 4 walls left where her bed had once stood. The Americans also tried to reach the mind, not just the stomach. In many camps, they set up education programs, talks about democracy, films about Nazi crimes, newspapers in German. Some prisoners rejected it all, others listened and argued. Over time, surveys taken by the US Army showed that only a small group, perhaps 5 to 10%, still called themselves strong Nazis by the time they went home. The rest were tired, doubtful, or ready to think in new ways. The first crack in my belief did not come from a film, Liselott wrote. It came from a bed. If they had treated me the way our side treated its enemies, I would have believed the old lies forever. When these men and women returned to Germany, they re-entered a society in ruins. Yet they brought with them a lived picture of how another system worked. Towns without secret police on every corner, churches still open, newspapers that could print criticism, police who did not always shout. At dinner tables in cold flats and crowded barracks, they told their families about it. Historians now argue about how deep this effect was, but we can count some results. By the early 1950s, West Germany had begun to build a new democracy with free elections and a strong parliament. In 1955, it joined NATO, standing openly with the same Western powers that had once held its soldiers and nurses behind fences. Opinion polls from that decade showed that a growing majority of West Germans saw the United States not as the main enemy, but as a partner, even if a difficult one at times. In this slow turn, the quiet facts of camp life mattered. Clean beds, fair treatment, and full plates did not erase grief or anger, but they undercut the story that the Nazis had told about the outside world. They showed that power could look like order and opportunity, not just tanks and flags. For Liselotte, the meaning stayed very simple. When asked late in life what had changed her most, she did not talk first about politics. She spoke about touch and sleep. The bed in Texas, she said, told me more about America than any speech. It said, "You are our enemy, but you are still a human being." After that, I could never again believe that all Americans were monsters, and I could not pretend all Germans were innocent. She knew too that not every story was like hers. Some prisoners suffered from harsh guards or poor conditions. Some went home more bitter than before. Nothing about this history is clean or perfect, but in her case, and in many others, the soft mattress and the steady meals broke down walls that bombs alone could not. In the end, the strangest twist was this. The people who had marched east and west in the name of conquest often learned their most lasting lessons while powerless, behind wire. They had come as conquerors. They left as students. For all the weapons and fire of the Second World War, some of the most powerful blows against Nazism fell in quiet ways. In classrooms, inside barbed fences, at camp hospital bedsides, in the small shock of being thanked by a guard. A clean bed, a warm meal, a fair rule book, these are not the still cursed when they saw them. She did not. Once, on a cold November day, she walked up to a group of US soldiers waiting on a platform and said in English, "I was your prisoner once. Thank you for not being what our leaders said you were." Their surprised smiles warmed the air more than the station's weak heater. Around this time, she began to write her memories down. At first, it was only for her children and for herself, in a notebook that smelled faintly of ink and old paper. But a local pastor who worked on German-American youth exchanges read it and said, "Others need this. It shows another side." In 1983, a small publisher printed 1,000 copies of her memoir under the simple title, My Bed in Texas. It was not a bestseller, but it was passed from hand to hand in schools and discussion groups. Students underlined lines where she wrote, "This was not propaganda, it was reality, and me, freedom without food and dignity feels thin." She spoke sometimes in classrooms, standing in front of blackboards now replaced by whiteboards that squeaked under marker pens. The smell of chalk dust had changed to dry erase solvent, but young faces still looked up, curious. "You must always ask," she told them, "who is my enemy and who told me so? What would I think if I shared a bed, or a meal, or a classroom with that person?" Her story was only one thread in a larger fabric. All across West Germany, former prisoners like her carried similar memories of fields in America, of full plates and fair rules. Together these stories began to bend how a whole generation thought about the old war and the new alliance. What happened to her in one Texas barracks room now reached far beyond her own family, and it was about to be measured not only in feelings but in numbers. Lieselotte's story was only one among many. Between 1942 and 1946, about 370,000 German prisoners of war were held in the United States, spread across more than 500 main and branch camps. They worked in fields, in lumber camps, in canning factories. They slept in long wooden barracks that smelled of dust, soap, and army stew. Almost all of them went home by early 1947. They carried no weapons, no loot, no medals. They carried memories. For years, Nazi leaders had told their people that America was soft, cruel, and godless all at once, a land of jazz, crime, and racial chaos that would fall apart under pressure. But behind the wire, many prisoners saw something different: regular meals, working lights, law that applied to guards as well as captives. One former POW later said, "We were counted, not beaten. We were fed, not starved. That was not propaganda, that was reality." The paradox was hard to fit into the old story. These men and women had worn uniforms of a regime that built death camps, yet on American soil usual tools of victory. Yet again and again they turned enemies into witnesses for a different way of living. As one former POW put it many years later, "The bombs destroyed our houses, the beds and the bread in America destroyed our hatred." Sometimes a mattress and a meal can do what no gun can. They can change what a person believes is possible. Lieselotte's path from a bombed-out room in Cologne to a prison bed in Texas and back to a fragile new life in West Germany shows how history can turn on very small things: a siren, a ship, a signature on a camp form, a sentence spoken by a tired sergeant. "You'll sleep in a bed tonight." None of these stopped the war, but together they shaped one mind, one family, and the way that families spoke about former enemies for the next 50 years. Her story reminds us that the fight between tyranny and freedom is not only on battlefields, it is also in hospital wards, dining halls, schoolrooms, and barracks. Bombs can win space, only dignity wins hearts. In a century of loud slogans and brutal systems, a simple truth remained: the side that offers its prisoners a bed and a future is already building the kind of world worth living in.